The Life of Julius Caesar, from the Lives of the 12 Caesars, by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. Part 2. All these enterprises and plans were cut short by Caesar's death. But before I speak of that, it will not be amiss to describe briefly his personal appearance, his dress, his mode of life, and his character, as well as his conduct in civil and military life. He is said to have been tall of stature with a fair complexion, shapely limbs, a somewhat full face, and keen black eyes, sound of health, except that towards the end he was subject to sudden fainting fits and to nightmare as well. He was twice attacked by the falling sickness during his campaigns. He was somewhat overnice in the care of his person, being not only carefully trimmed and shaved, but even having superfluous hair plucked out, as some have charged, while his baldness was a disfigurement which troubled him greatly, since he found that it was often the subject of the gibes of his detractors. Because of it he used to comb forward his scanty locks from the crown of his head, and of all the honors voted him by the Senate and people there was none which he received or made use of more gladly than the privilege of wearing a laurel wreath at all times. They say, too, that he was remarkable in his dress, that he wore a senator's tunic with fringed sleeves reaching to the wrist, and always had a girdle over it, though rather a loose one, and this, they say, was the occasion of Sulla's mot, when he often warned the nobles to keep an eye on the ill-girt boy. He lived at first in the Suburri in a modest house, but after he became Pontifex Maximus, in the official residence on the Sacred Way. Many have written that he was very fond of elegance and luxury, that having laid the foundations of a country house on his estate at Nemi, and finished it at great cost, he tore it all down, because it did not suit him in every particular, although at the time he was still poor and heavily in debt, and that he carried tessellated and mosaic floors about with him on his campaigns. They say that he was led to invade Britain by the hope of getting pearls, and that in comparing their size he sometimes weighed them with his own hand, that he was always a most enthusiastic collector of gems, carvings, statues, and pictures by early artists, also of slaves of exceptional figure and training at enormous prices, of which he himself was so ashamed that he forbade their entry in his accounts. It is further reported that in the provinces he gave banquets constantly in 2 dining halls, in one of which his officers or Greek companions, in the other Roman civilians, and the more distinguished of the provincials reclined at table. He was so punctilious and strict in the management of his household, in small matters as well as in those of greater importance, that he put his baker in iron for serving him with one kind of bread and his guests with another, and he inflicted capital punishment on a favorite freedman for adultery with the wife of a Roman knight, although no complaint was made against him. There was no stain on his reputation for chastity except his intimacy with King Nicomedes, but that was a deep and lasting reproach, which laid him open to insults from every quarter. I say nothing of the notorious lines of Licinius Calvus, whate'er Bithynia had, and Caesar's paramour. I pass over, too, the invectives of Dolabella and the elder Curio, in which Dolabella calls him the queen's rival, the inner partner of the royal couch, and Curio, the brothel of Nicomedes and the stew of Bithynia. I take no account of the edicts of Bibulus, in which he posted his colleague as the queen of Bithynia, saying that of yore he was enamored of a king, but now of a king's estate. At this same time, so Marcus Brutus declares, one Octavius, a man whose disordered mind made him somewhat free with his tongue, after saluting Pompey as king in a crowded assembly, greeted Caesar as queen. But Gaius Memmius makes the direct charge that he acted as cupbearer to Nicomedes with the rest of his wantons at a large dinner party, and that among the guests were some merchants from Rome, whose names Memmius gives. Cicero, indeed, is not content with having written in sundry letters that Caesar was led by the king's attendants to the royal apartments, that he lay on a golden couch arrayed in purple, and that the virginity of this son of Venus was lost in Bithynia. But when Caesar was once addressing the Senate in defense of Nysa, daughter of Nicomedes, and was enumerating his obligations to the king, Cicero cried, "No more of that, pray, for it is well known what he gave you, and what you gave him in turn." Finally, in his Gallic triumph, his soldiers, among the bantering songs which are usually sung by those who followed the chariot, shouted these lines, which became a byword: "All the Gauls did Caesar vanquish, Nicomedes vanquished him. Lo, now Caesar rides in triumph, victor over all the Gauls. Nicomedes does not triumph, who subdued the conqueror. That he was unbridled and extravagant in his intrigue is the general opinion, and that he seduced many illustrious women, among them Postumia, wife of Servius Sulpicius, Lollia, wife of Aulus Gabinius, Turdilla, wife of Marcus Crassus, and even Gnaeus Pompey's wife Mucia. At all events, there is no doubt that Pompey was taken to task by the elder and the younger Curio, as well as by many others, because through a desire for power he had afterwards married the daughter of a man on whose account he divorced a wife who had borne him 3 children, and whom he had often referred to with a groan as an Aegisthus. But beyond all others Caesar loved Servilia, the mother of Marcus Brutus, for whom in his first consulship he bought a pearl costing 6,000,000 sesterces. During the Civil War, too, besides other presents, he knocked down some fine estates to her in a public auction at a nominal price, and when some expressed their surprise at the low figure, Cicero wittily remarked, "It's a better bargain than you think, for there is a third off." And in fact it was thought that Servilia was prostituting her own daughter Tertia to Caesar. That he did not refrain from intrigues in the provinces is shown in particular by this couplet, which was also shouted by the soldiers in his Gallic triumph: "Men of Rome, keep close to your consorts, here's a bold adulterer. Gold in Gaul you spent in dalliance, which you borrowed here in Rome. He had love affairs with queens too, including Juno the Moor, wife of Bogyudes, on whom, as well as on her husband, he bestowed many splendid presents, as Naso writes, but above all with Cleopatra, with whom he often feasted until daybreak, and he would have gone through Egypt with her in her state barge almost to Ethiopia, had not his soldiers refused to allow him. Finally he called her to Rome, and did not let her leave until he had laden her with high honors and rich gifts, and he allowed her to give his name to the child which she bore. In fact, according to certain Greek writers, this child was very like Caesar in looks and carriage. Mark Antony declared to the Senate that Caesar had really acknowledged the boy, and that Gaius Matius, Gaius Oppius, and other friends of Caesar knew this. Of these Gaius Oppius, as if admitting that the situation required apology and defense, published a book to prove that the child whom Cleopatra fathered on Caesar was not his. Helvius Cinna, tribune of the commons, admitted to several that he had a bill drawn up in due form, which Caesar had ordered him to propose to the people in his absence, making it lawful for Caesar to marry what wives he wished, and as many as he wished, for the purpose of begetting children, but to remove all doubt that he had an evil reputation both for shameless vice and for adultery, I have only to add that the elder Curio in one of his speeches calls him every woman's man and every man's woman, that he drank very little wine, not even his enemies denied. There is a saying of Marcus Cato that Caesar was the only man who undertook to overthrow the state when sober. Even in the matter of food, Gaius Suetonius tells us that he was so indifferent that once when his host served stale oil instead of fresh, and the other guests would have none of it, Caesar partook even more plentifully than usual, not to seem to charge his host with carelessness or lack of manners. Neither when in command of armies nor as a magistrate at Rome did he show a scrupulous integrity, for as certain men have declared in their memoir, when he was proconsul in Spain, he not only begged money from the allies to help pay his debts, but also attacked and sacked some towns of the Lusitanians, although they did not refuse his terms and opened their gates to him on his arrival. In Gaul he pillaged shrines and temples of the gods filled with offerings, and oftener sacked towns for the sake of plunder than for any fault. In consequence he had more gold than he knew what to do with, and offered it for sale throughout Italy and the provinces at the rate of 3,000 sesterces the pound. In his first consulship he stole 3,000 pounds of gold from the capital, replacing it with the same weight of gilded bronze. He made alliances and thrones a matter of barter, for he extorted from Ptolemy alone in his own name and that of Pompey nearly 6,000 talents, while later on he met the heavy expenses of the civil wars and of his triumphs and entertainments by the most barefaced pillage and sacrilege. In eloquence and in the art of war he either equaled or surpassed the fame of their most eminent representatives. After his accusation of Dolabella, he was without question numbered with the leading advocates. At all events, when Cicero reviews the orators in his Brutus, he says that he does not see to whom Caesar ought to yield the palm, declaring that his style is elegant as well as transparent, even grand and in a sense noble. F. again, in a letter to Cornelius Nepos, he writes thus of Caesar: "Come now, what orator would you rank above him of those who have devoted themselves to nothing else? Who has clever or more frequent epigrams? Who is either more picturesque or more choice in diction? He appears, at least in his youth, to have imitated the manner of Caesar Strabo, from whose speech entitled For the Sardinians he actually transferred some passages word for word to a trial address of his own. He is said to have delivered himself in a high-pitched voice with impassioned action and gestures which were not without grace. He left several speeches, including some which are attributed to him on insufficient evidence. Augustus had good reason to think that the speech for Quintus Metellus was rather taken down by shorthand writers who could not keep pace with his delivery than published by Caesar himself, for in some copies I find that even the title is not for Metellus, but which he wrote for Metellus, although the discourse purports to be from Caesar's lips, defending Metellus and himself against the charges of their common detractors. Augustus also questions the authenticity of the address to his soldiers in Spain, although there are two sections of it, one purporting to have been spoken at the first battle, the other at the second, when Asinius Pollio writes that because of the sudden onslaught of the enemy he actually did not have time to make an harangue. He left memoirs too of his deeds in the Gallic War and in the civil strife with Pompey, for the author of the Alexandrian, African, and Spanish wars is unknown. Some think it was Oppius, others Hirtius, who also supplied the final book of the Gallic War, which Caesar left unwritten. With regard to Caesar's memoirs, Cicero also in the Brutus speaks in the following terms: "He wrote memoirs which deserve the highest praise. They are naked in their simplicity, straightforward, yet graceful, stripped of all rhetorical adornment, as of a garment, but while his purpose was to supply material to others, on which those who wished to write history might draw, he haply gratified silly folk, who will try to use the curling irons on his narrative, but he has kept men of any sense from touching the subject. Of these same memoirs, Hirtius uses this emphatic language. They are so highly rated in the judgment of all men that he seems to have deprived writers of an opportunity rather than given them one. Yet our admiration for this feat is greater than that of others, for they know how well and faultlessly he wrote, while we know besides how easily and rapidly he finished his task. Asinius Pollio thinks that they were put together somewhat carelessly and without strict regard for truth, since in many cases Caesar was too ready to believe the accounts which others gave of their actions, and gave a perverted account of his own, either designedly or perhaps from forgetfulness, and he thinks that he intended to rewrite and revise them. He left, besides a work in 2 volumes on analogy, the same number of speeches criticizing Cato, in addition to a poem entitled The Journey. He wrote the first of these works while crossing the Alps and returning to his army from Hither Gaul, where he had held the assizes, the second about the time of the Battle of Munda, and the third in the course of a 24 days' journey from Rome to farther Spain. Some letters of his to the Senate are also preserved, and he seems to have been the first to reduce such documents to pages and the form of a notebook, whereas previously consuls and generals sent their reports written right across the sheet. There are also letters of his to Cicero, as well as to his intimates on private affairs, and in the latter, if he had anything confidential to say, he wrote it in cipher, that is, by so changing the order of the letters of the alphabet that not a word could be made out. If anyone wishes to decipher these and get at their meaning, he must substitute the 4th letter of the alphabet, namely D, for a, and so with the others. We also have mention of certain writings of his boyhood and early youth, such as the Praises of Hercules, a tragedy Oedipus, and a collection of apophthegms, but Augustus forbade the publication of all these minor works, in a very brief and frank letter sent to Pompeius Macer, whom he had selected to set his libraries in order. He was highly skilled in arms and horsemanship, and of incredible powers of endurance. On the march he headed his army, sometimes on horseback, but oftener on foot, bareheaded both in the heat of the sun and in rain. He covered great distances with incredible speed, making 100 miles a day in a hired carriage and with little baggage, swimming the rivers which barred his path, or crossing them on inflated skins, and very often arriving before the messenger sent to announce his coming. In the conduct of his campaigns, it is a question whether he was more cautious or more daring, for he never led his army where ambuscades were possible without carefully reconnoitering the country, and he did not cross to Britain without making personal inquiries about the harbors, the course, and the approach to the island. But on the other hand, when news came that his camp in Germany was beleaguered, he made his way to his men through the enemy's pickets, disguised as a Gaul. He crossed from Brundisium to Dyrrhachium in winter-time, running the blockade of the enemy's fleets, and when the troops which he had ordered to follow him delayed to do so, and he had sent to fetch them many times in vain, at last in secret, and alone he boarded a small boat at night with his head muffled up, and he did not reveal who he was, or suffer the helmsmen to give way to the gale blowing in their teeth, until he was all but overwhelmed by the waves. No regard for religion ever turned him from any undertaking, or even delayed him. Though the victim escaped as he was offering sacrifice, he did not put off his expedition against Scipio and Juba. Even when he had a fall as he disembarked, he gave the omen a favorable turn by crying, "I hold thee fast, Africa." Furthermore, to make the prophecies ridiculous which declared that the stock of the Scipios was fated to be fortunate, and invincible in that province, he kept with him in camp a contemptible fellow belonging to the Cornelian family, to whom the nickname Salvino had been given as a reproach for his manner of life. He joined battle, not only after planning his movements in advance, but on a sudden opportunity, often immediately at the end of a march, and sometimes in the foulest weather, when one would least expect him to make a move. It was not until his later years that he became slower to engage, through a conviction that the oftener he had been victor, the less he ought to tempt fate, and that he could not possibly gain as much by success as he might lose by defeat. He never put his enemy to flight without also driving him from his camp, thus giving him no respite in his panic. When the issue was doubtful, he used to send away the horses, and his own among the first, to impose upon the troops the greater necessity of standing their ground by taking away that aid to flight. He rode a remarkable horse, too, with feet that were almost human, for its hoofs were cloven in such a way as to look like toes. This horse was foaled on his own place, and since the soothsayers had declared that it foretold the rule of the world for its master, he reared it with the greatest care, and was the first to mount it, for it would endure no other rider. Afterwards, too, he dedicated a statue of it before the temple of Venus Genetrix. When his army gave way, he often rallied it single-handed, planting himself in the way of the fleeing men, laying hold of them one by one, and even catching them by the throat and forcing them to face the enemy. That, too, when they were in such a panic that an eagle-bearer made a pass at him with the point as he tried to stop him, while another left the standard in Caesar's hand when he would hold him back. His presence of mind was no less renowned, and the instances of it will appear even more striking. After the Battle of Pharsalus, when he had sent on his troops and was crossing the Strait of the Hellespont in a small passenger boat, he met Lucius Cassius of the hostile party with 10 armored ships, and made no attempt to escape, but went to meet Cassius and actually urged him to surrender. And Cassius sued for mercy and was taken on board. At Alexandria, while assaulting a bridge, he was forced by a sudden sally of the enemy to take to a small skiff. When many others threw themselves into the same boat, he plunged into the sea, and after swimming for 200 paces, got away to the nearest ship, holding up his left hand all the way, so as not to wet some papers which he was carrying, and dragging his cloak after him with his teeth, to keep the enemy from getting it as a trophy. He valued his soldiers neither for their personal character nor for their fortune, but solely for their prowess, and he treated them with equal strictness and indulgence, for he did not curb them everywhere, and at all times, but only in the presence of the enemy. Then he required the strictest discipline, not announcing the time of a march or a battle, but keeping them ready and alert to be led on a sudden at any moment wheresoever he might wish. He often called them out even when there was no occasion for it, especially on rainy days and holidays, and warning them every now and then that they must keep close watch on him. He would steal away suddenly by day or night and make a longer march than usual to tire out those who were tardy in following. When they were in a panic through reports about the enemy's numbers, he used to rouse their courage, not by denying or discounting the rumors, but by falsely exaggerating the true danger. For instance, when the anticipation of Juba's coming filled them with terror, he called the soldiers together and said, "Let me tell you that within the next few days the king will be here with 10 legions, 30,000 horsemen, 100,000 light-armed troops, and 300 elephants. Therefore some of you may as well cease to ask further questions or make surmises, and may rather believe me, since I know all about it. Otherwise I shall surely have them shipped on some worn-out craft and carried off to whatever lands the wind may blow them." He did not take notice of all their offenses or punish them by rule, but he kept a sharp lookout for deserters and mutineers, and chastised them most severely, shutting his eyes to other faults. Sometimes, too, after a great victory, he relieved of all duties and gave them full license to revel, being in the habit of boasting that his soldiers could fight well even when reeking of perfumes. In the assembly he addressed them not as soldiers, but by the more flattering term comrades, and he kept them in fine trim, furnishing them with arms inlaid with silver and gold, both for show, and to make them hold the faster to them in battle, through fear of the greatness of the loss. Such was his love for them that when he heard of the disaster to Titurius, he let his hair and beard grow long, and would not cut them until he had taken vengeance. In this way he made them most devoted to his interests, as well as most valiant. When he began the civil war, every centurion of each legion proposed to supply a horseman from his own savings, and the soldiers one and all offered their service without pay and without rations, the richer assuming the care of the poorer. Throughout the long struggle not one deserted, and many of them, on being taken prisoner, refused to accept their lives when offered them on the condition of consenting to serve against Caesar. They bore hunger and other hardships, both when in a state of siege and when besieging others, with such fortitude that when Pompey saw in the works at Dyrrhachium a kind of bread made of herbs, on which they were living, he said that he was fighting wild beasts, and he gave orders that it be put out of sight quickly and shown to none of his men, for fear that the endurance and resolution of the foe would break their spirit. How valiantly they fought is shown by the fact that when they suffered their sole defeat before Dyrrhachium, they insisted on being punished, and their commander felt called upon rather to console them than to chastise them. In the other battles they overcame with ease countless forces of the enemy, though decidedly fewer in number themselves. Indeed, one cohort of the 6th Legion, when sent to defend a redoubt, kept 4 legions of Pompey at bay for several hours, though almost all were wounded by the enemy's showers of arrows, of which 130,000 were picked up within the ramparts. And no wonder, when one thinks of the deeds of individual soldiers, either of Cassius Sceva the centurion, or of Gaius Suetonius of the rank and file, not to mention others. Sceva with one eye gone, his thigh and shoulder wounded, and his shield bored through in 120 places, continued to guard the gate of a fortress put in his charge. Acilius in the sea fight at Massilia grasped the stern of one of the enemy's ships, and when his right hand was lopped off, rivaling the famous exploit of the Greek hero Cynegeirus, boarded the ship and drove the enemy before him with the boss of his shield. They did not mutiny once during the 10 years of the Gallic War. In the civil wars they did so now and then, but quickly resumed their duty, not so much owing to any indulgence of their general as to his authority. For he never gave way to them when they were insubordinate, but always boldly faced them, discharging the entire 9th Legion in disgrace before Placentia, though Pompey was still in the field, reinstating them unwillingly and only after many abject entreaties, and insisting on punishing the ringleaders. Again at Rome, when the men of the 10th clamored for their discharge and rewards with terrible threats and no little peril to the city, though the war in Africa was then raging, he did not hesitate to appear before them, against the advice of his friends, and to disband them, but with a single word, calling them citizens, instead of soldiers. He easily brought them round and bent them to his will, for they at once replied that they were his soldiers, and insisted on following him to Africa, although refused their service. Even then he punished the most insubordinate by the loss of a 1/3 part of the booty and of the land intended for them. Even when a young man he showed no lack of devotion and fidelity to his dependents. He defended Macinther, a youth of high birth, against King Hiempsal, with such spirit that in the dispute he caught the king's son Juba by the beard. On Messindus being declared tributary to the king, he at once rescued him from those who would carry him off and kept him hidden for some time in his own house. And when presently he left for Spain after his praetorship, he carried the young man off in his own litter, unnoticed amid the crowd that came to see him off, and the lictors with their fasces. His friends he treated with invariable kindness and consideration. When Gaius Suetonius was his companion on a journey through a wild, woody country and was suddenly taken ill, Caesar gave up to him the only shelter there was, while he himself slept on the ground out of doors. Moreover, when he came to power, he advanced some of his friends to the highest positions, even though they were of the humblest origin, and when taken to task for it, flatly declared that if he had been helped in defending his honor by brigands and cutthroats, he would have requited even such men in the same way. On the other hand, he never formed such bitter enmities that he was not glad to lay them aside when opportunity offered. Although Gaius Memmius had made highly caustic speeches against him, to which he had replied with equal bitterness, he went so far as to support Memmius afterwards in his suit for the consulship. When Gaius Calvus, after some scurrilous epigrams, took steps through his friends towards a reconciliation, Caesar wrote to him first, and of his own free will. Valerius Catullus, as Caesar himself did not hesitate to say, inflicted a lasting stain on his name by the verses about Mamera. Yet when he apologized, Caesar invited the poet to dinner that very same day, and continued his usual friendly relations with Catullus's father. Even in avenging wrongs he was by nature most merciful, and when he got hold of the pirates who had captured him, he had them crucified, since he had sworn beforehand that he would do so, but ordered that their throats be cut first. He could never make up his mind to harm Cornelius Fagites, although when he was sick and in hiding, the man had waylaid him night after night, and even a bribe had barely saved him from being handed over to Sulla. The slave Philemon, his amanuensis, who had promised Caesar's enemies that he would poison him, he merely punished by death, without torture. When summoned as a witness against Publius Clodius, the paramour of his wife Pompeia, charged was on the same count with sacrilege, Caesar declared that he had no evidence, although both his mother Aurelia and his sister Julia had given the same jurors a faithful account of the whole affair, and on being asked why it was then that he had put away his wife, he replied, "Because I maintain that the members of my family should be free from suspicion, as well as from accusation." He certainly showed admirable self-restraint and mercy, both in his conduct of the civil war and in the hour of victory. While Pompey announced that he would treat as enemies those who did not take up arms for the government, Caesar gave out that those who were neutral and of neither party would be numbered with his friends. He freely allowed all those whom he had made centurions on Pompey's recommendation to go over to his rival. When conditions of surrender were under discussion at Ilerda, and friendly intercourse between the two parties was constant, Afranius and Petreius, with a sudden change of purpose, put to death all of Caesar's soldiers whom they found in their camp, but Caesar could not bring himself to retaliate in kind. At the battle of Pharsalus he cried out, "Spare your fellow citizens," and afterwards allowed each of his men to save any one man he pleased of the opposite party. And it will be found that no Pompeian lost his life except in battle, save only Afranius and Faustus, and the young Lucius Caesar. And it is believed that not even these men were slain by his wish, even though the two former had taken up arms again, after being pardoned, while Caesar had not only cruelly put to death the dictator's slaves and freedmen with fire and sword, but had even butchered the wild beasts which he had procured for the entertainment of the people. At last, in his later years, he went so far as to allow all those whom he had not yet pardoned to return to Italy, and to hold magistracies and the command of armies. And he actually set up the statues of Lucius Sully and Pompey, which had been broken to pieces by the populace. After this, if any dangerous plots were formed against him, or slanders uttered, he preferred to quash rather than to punish them. Accordingly, he took no further notice of the conspiracies which were detected, and of meetings by night, than to make known by proclamation that he was aware of them, and he thought it enough to give public warning to those who spoke ill of him, not to persist in their conduct, bearing with good nature the attacks on his reputation made by the scurrilous volume of Aulus Caecina and the abusive lampoons of Pitholaus. Yet after all, his other actions and words so turned the scale, that it is thought that he abused his power, and was justly slain. For not only did he accept excessive honors, such as an uninterrupted consulship, the dictatorship for life, and the censorship of public morals, as well as the forename imperator, the surname of father of his country, a statue among those of the kings, and a raised couch in the orchestra. But he also allowed honors to be bestowed on him which were too great for mortal man, a golden throne in the house and on the judgment seat, a chariot and litter in the procession at the circus, temples, altars, and statues beside those of the gods, a special priest, an additional college of the Luperci, and the calling of one of the months by his name. In fact, there were no honors which he did not receive or confer at pleasure. He held his third and fourth consulships in name only, content with the power of the dictatorship conferred on him at the same time as the consulships. Moreover, in both years he substituted 2 consuls for himself for the last 3 months, in the meantime holding no elections except for tribunes and plebeian aediles, and appointing prefects instead of the praetors to manage the affairs of the city during his absence. When one of the consuls suddenly died the day before the calends of January, he gave the vacant office for a few hours to a man who asked for it. With the same disregard of law and precedent, he named magistrates for several years to come, bestowed the emblems of consular rank on 10 ex-praetors, and admitted to the house men who had been given citizenship, and in some cases half-civilized Gauls. He assigned the charge of the mint and of the public revenues to his own slaves, and gave the oversight and command of the 3 legions which he had left at Alexandria to a favorite of his called Rufio, son of one of his freedmen. No less arrogant were his public utterances, which Titus Ampius records, that the state was nothing, a mere name without body or form, that Sulla did not know his A, B, C when he laid down his dictatorship, that men ought now to be more circumspect in addressing him, and to regard his word as law. So far did he go in his presumption, that when a soothsayer once reported direful inwards without a heart, he said, "They will be more favorable when I wish it. It should not be regarded as important if a beast has no heart." But it was the following action in particular that roused deadly hatred against him. When the Senate approached him in a body with many highly honorary decrees, he received them before the temple of Venus Janitrix without rising. Some think that when he attempted to get up, he was held back by Cornelius Balbus. Others, that he made no such move at all, but on the contrary frowned angrily on Gaius Trebatius when he suggested that he should rise. And this action of his seemed the more intolerable, because when he himself in one of his triumphal processions rode past the benches of the tribunes, he was so incensed because a member of the college, Pontius Aquila, did not rise, that he cried, "Come then, Aquila, take back the republic from me, you tribune, and for several days he would not make a promise to anyone without adding, that is, if Pontius Aquila will allow me. To an insult which so plainly showed his contempt for the Senate he added an act of even greater insolence. For at the Latin festival, as he was returning to the city, amid the extravagant and unprecedented demonstrations of the populace, someone in the press placed on his statue a laurel wreath with a white fillet tied to it. When Pitius Marullus and Cecilius Flavius, tribunes of the commons, gave orders that the ribbon be removed from the wreath and the man taken off to prison, Caesar sharply rebuked and deposed them, either offended that the hint at regal power had been received with so little favor, or, as he asserted, that he had been robbed of the glory of refusing it. But from that time on he could not rid himself of the odium of having aspired to the title of monarch, although he replied to the commons, when they hailed him as king, I am Caesar and no king. And at the Lupercalia, when the consul Antony several times attempted to place a crown upon his head as he spoke from the rostra, he put it aside, and at last sent it to the Capitol, to be offered to Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Nay, more, the report had spread in various quarters that he intended to move to Ilium or Alexandria, taking with him the resources of the state, draining Italy by levies, and leaving the charge of the city to his friends. Also that at the next meeting of the Senate Lucius Cotta would announce as the decision of 15, that inasmuch as it was written in the books of fate that the Parthians could be conquered only by a king, Caesar should be given that title. It was this that led the conspirators to hasten in carrying out their designs, in order to avoid giving their assent to this proposal. Therefore the plots, which had previously been formed separately, often by groups of 2 or 3, were united in a general conspiracy, since even the populace no longer were pleased with present conditions, but both secretly and openly rebelled at his tyranny and cried out for defenders of their liberty. On the admission of foreigners to the Senate, a placard was posted, God bless the Commonwealth. Let no one consent to point out the house to a newly made senator. The following verses, too, were sung everywhere. Caesar led the Gauls in triumph, led them to the Senate house. Then the Gauls put off their breeches and put on the laticlave. When Quintus Maximus, whom he had appointed consul in his place for 3 months, was entering the theater, and his lictor called attention to his arrival in the usual manner, a general shout was raised, "He's no consul." At the first election after the deposing of Cecilius and Marullus, the tribunes, several votes were found for their appointment as consuls. Some wrote on the base of Lucius Brutus' statue, "Oh, that you were still alive," and on that of Caesar himself. First of all was Brutus consul, since he drove the kings from Rome. Since this man drove out the consuls, he at last is made our king. More than 60 joined the conspiracy against him, led by Gaius Cassius and Marcus and Decimus Brutus. At first they hesitated whether to form 2 divisions at the elections in the Campus Martius, so that while some hurled him from the bridge as he summoned the tribes to vote, the rest might wait below and slay him, or to set upon him in the sacred way or at the entrance to the theater. When, however, a meeting of the Senate was called for the Ides of March in the hall of Pompey, they readily gave that time and place the preference. Now Caesar's approaching murder was foretold to him by unmistakable signs. A few months before, when the settlers assigned to the colony at Capua by the Julian law were demolishing some tombs of great antiquity to build country houses, they plied their work with a greater vigor because as they rummaged about they found a quantity of vases of ancient workmanship. There was discovered in a tomb, which was said to be that of Capys, the founder of Capua, a bronze tablet inscribed with Greek words and characters to this purport: "Whenever the bones of Capys shall be moved, it will come to pass that a son of Ilium shall be slain at the hands of his kindred, and presently avenged at heavy cost to Italy. And let no one think this tale a myth or a lie, for it is vouched for by Cornelius Balbus, an intimate friend of Caesar. Shortly before his death, as he was told, the herds of horses which he had dedicated to the river Rubicon when he crossed it, and had let loose without a keeper, stubbornly refused to graze, and wept copiously. Again, when he was offering sacrifice, the soothsayer Spurita warned him to beware of danger, which would come not later than the Ides of March, and on the day before the Ides of that month a little bird called the king-bird flew into the hall of Pompey with a sprig of laurel, pursued by others of various kinds from the grove hard by, which tore it to pieces in the hall. In fact, the very night before his murder he dreamt now that he was flying above the clouds, and now that he was clasping the hand of Jupiter, and his wife Calpurnia thought that the pediment of their house fell, and that her husband was stabbed in her arms, and on a sudden the door of the room flew open of its own accord. Both for these reasons, and because of poor health, he hesitated for a long time whether to stay at home, and put off what he had planned to do in the Senate. But at last, urged by Decimus Brutus not to disappoint the full meeting which had for some time been waiting for him, he went forth almost at the end of the 5th hour, and when a note revealing the plot was handed him by someone on the way, he put it with others which he held in his left hand, intending to read them presently. Then, after several victims had been slain, and he could not get favorable omens, he entered the house in defiance of portents, laughing at Spurita and calling him a false prophet, because the Ides of March were come without bringing him harm, though Spurita replied that they had of a truth come, but they had not gone. As he took his seat, the conspirators gathered about him as if to pay their respects, and straightway Tullius Cimber, who had assumed the lead, came nearer as though to ask something, and when Caesar with a gesture put him off to another time, Cimber caught his toga by both shoulders. Then as Caesar cried, "Why, this is violence," one of the Cascas stabbed him from one side just below the throat. Caesar caught Casca's arm and ran it through with his stylus, but as he tried to leap to his feet, he was stopped by another wound. When he saw that he was beset on every side by drawn daggers, he muffled his head in his robe, and at the same time drew down its lap to his feet with his left hand, in order to fall more decently, with the lower part of his body also covered. And in this wise he was stabbed with 23 wounds, uttering not a word, but merely a groan at the first stroke. Though some have written that when Marcus Brutus rushed at him, he said in Greek, "You too, my child." All the conspirators made off, and he lay there lifeless for some time, and finally 3 common slaves put him on a litter and carried him home, with one arm hanging down. And of so many wounds none turned out to be mortal, in the opinion of the physician Antistius, except the second one in the breast. The conspirators had intended, after slaying him, to drag his body to the Tiber, confiscate his property, and revoke his decrees, but they forbore through fear of Marcus Antonius the consul, and Lepidus, the master of horse. Then, at the request of his father-in-law, Lucius Piso, the will was unsealed, and read in Antony's house, which Caesar had made on the preceding Ides of September at his place near Lavicum, and put in the care of the chief of the Vestals. Quintus Tubero states that from his first consulship until the beginning of the civil war it was his wont to write down Gnaeus Pompeius as his heir, and to read this to the assembled soldiers. In his last will, however, he named 3 heirs, his sister's grandsons, Gaius Octavius, to 3/4 of his estate, and Lucius Pinarius and Quintus Pedius to share the remainder. At the end of the will, too, he adopted Gaius Octavius into his family and gave him his name. He named several of his assassins among the guardians of his son, in case one should be born to him, and Decimus Brutus even among his heirs in the second degree. To the people he left his gardens near the Tiber for their common use, and 300 sesterces to each man. When the funeral was announced, a pyre was erected in the Campus Martius near the tomb of Julia, and on the rostra a gilded shrine was placed, made after the model of the temple of Venus Genetrix. Within was a couch of ivory with coverlets of purple and gold, and at its head a pillar hung with the robe in which he was slain. Since it was clear that the day would not be long enough for those who offered gifts, they were directed to bring them to the campus by whatsoever streets of the city they wished, regardless of any order of precedence. At the funeral games, to rouse pity and indignation at his death, these words from the contest for the arms of Pacuvius were sung. "Saved I these men that they might murder me," and words of like purport from the Electra of Attilius. Instead of a eulogy, the consul Antonius caused a herald to recite the decree of the Senate in which it had voted Caesar all divine and human honors at once, and likewise the oath with which they had all pledged themselves to watch over his personal safety, to which he added a very few words of his own. The bier on the rostra was carried down into the forum by magistrates and ex-magistrates, and while some were urging that it be burned in the temple of Jupiter on the Capitol, and others in the hall of Pompey, on a sudden 2 beings with swords by their sides and brandishing a pair of darts set fire to it with blazing torches, and at once the throng of bystanders heaped upon it dry branches, the judgment seats with the benches, and whatever else could serve as an offering. Then the musicians and actors tore off their robes, which they had taken from the equipment of his triumphs and put on for the occasion, rent them to bits and threw them into the flames, and the veterans of the legions, the arms with which they had adorned themselves for the funeral, many of the women, too, offered up the jewels which they wore and the amulets and robes of their children. At the height of the public grief, a throng of foreigners went about lamenting each after the fashion of his country, of all the Jews, who even flocked to the place for several successive nights. Immediately after the funeral, the commons ran to the houses of Brutus and Cassius with firebrands, and after being repelled with difficulty, they slew Helvius Cinna when they met him through a mistake in the name, supposing that he was Cornelius Cinna, who had the day before made a bitter indictment of Caesar, and for whom they were looking, and they set his head upon a spear, and paraded it about the streets. Afterwards they set up in the forum a solid column of Numidian marble almost 20 feet high, and inscribed upon it, "To the father of his country." At the foot of this they continued for a long time to sacrifice, make vows, and settle some of their disputes by an oath in the name of Caesar. Caesar left in the minds of some of his friends the suspicion that he did not wish to live longer and had taken no precautions because of his failing health, and that therefore he neglected the warnings which came to him from Portents and from the reports of his friends. Some think that it was because he had full trust in the last decree of the senators, and their oath that he dismissed even the armed bodyguard of Spanish soldiers that formerly attended him. Others, on the contrary, believe that he elected to expose himself once for all to the plots that threaten him on every hand, rather than to be always anxious and on his guard. Some, too, say that he was wont to declare that it was not so much to his own interest as to that of his country that he remain alive. He had long since had his fill of power and glory, but if aught befell him, the commonwealth would have no peace, but would be plunged in strife under much worse conditions. About one thing almost all are fully agreed, that he all but desired such a death as he met. For once when he read in Xenophon how Cyrus in his last illness gave directions for his funeral, he expressed his horror of such a lingering kind of end, and his wish for one which was swift and sudden. And the day before his murder, in a conversation which arose at a dinner at the house of Marcus Lepidus, as to what manner of death was most to be desired, he had given his preference to one which was sudden and unexpected. He died in the 56th year of his age, and was numbered among the gods, not only by a formal decree, but also in the conviction of the common people. For at the first of the games which his heir Augustus gave in honor of his apotheosis, a comet shone for 7 successive days, rising about the 11th hour, and was believed to be the soul of Caesar, who had been taken to heaven. And this is why a star is set upon the crown of his head in his statue. It was voted that the hall in which he was slain be walled up, that the Ides of March be called the Day of Parricide, and that a meeting of the Senate should never be called on that day. Hardly any of his assassins survived him for more than 3 years, or died a natural death. They were all condemned, and they perished in various ways, some by shipwreck, some in battle, some took their own lives with the self-same dagger with which they had impiously slain Caesar.